Assalamualaikum and greeting Professor and everybody. It's honor for our group today to deliver a presentation. My name is Malaysia binti Mamat. I'm going to present the topic about privatization. First of all, I will present about privatization of education and development. After that, my friends will continue with the another topic. There are three topics we will present. First, privatization of education and development. Second one, about criticism on privatization of education. And third one, higher education and development. The privatization of education is a global phenomenon with multiple manifestations in northern and southern countries and states with very different educational traditions and regulatory frameworks. Has promoted pro-privatization reforms for many reasons: social, political, economic, and educational. Among the most emblematic policies promoting the role of the private sector in education are charter schools, voucher schemes, or the contracting of private schools. So we have to understand the privatization is the term has come into 1980s subsequent on economic reforms. The term privatization refers to the transfer of government services or assets to the private sector. So what is privatization? Privatization is a process that can be defined as the transfer of activities, assets, and responsibilities from government or public institutions and organizations to private individuals and agencies, from Belfield and Levin 2002. The private sector plays an important role in pre-tertiary education. There are many private schools set up by the private sector, especially in urban areas, and these schools offer preschool, primary, and secondary education for a fee. Some even offer post-secondary education. Private system and the history of private education in Malaysia can be traced way back to the 1950s. In its efforts to democratize education, the government has encouraged more private education providers to increase the education options in the country. So private school is schools not managed by public authorities, and the general pattern, the higher school level, the bigger private sector. A global wave of privatization since the 1980s in economic and social pressures. Privatization solutions are recommended and advocated by a broad spectrum of actors, from local interest groups of international organizations and private foundations. In some settings, even strange bedfellows or we call agents with apparently divergent interests, such as ethnic minority groups and conservative think tanks, and are advocating for similar forms of education privatization. To all of these different actors, privatization is seen as a formula to expand choice, improve quality, boost efficiency, or increase equity, or all of these things simultaneously in the educational system. General overview of some of the most relevant existing indicators concerning education provision and spending confirms these trends in most world locations. As figure 1.1 shows, the percentage of enrollment in private primary school has increased in most countries. Whatever the level of economic development, although this trend is not so marked in high income and lower middle income countries. According Ball and Yodel 2008 famously distinguished between two main types of privatization trends and related policies. First, privatization of public education, or exogenous privatization, which involve the opening up of public education service to private sector participation on a profit basis and using the private sector to design, manage or deliver aspect of public education. And secondly, privatization in public education or endogenous privatization, which involve the importing of ideas, techniques and practice from the private sector in order to make the public sector more like business and more business-like. Just as every child is unique, so too are the different types of private schools. No matter your child's abilities or your family's personal belief, you are likely to find a private school that meets your needs. There are types of private school sourced by Hussein's classifications. Most types of private school can be categorized based on the source of the school's funding. They may be classified as independent non-profit, which usually means the school answers to a board of directors or some other private overseeing body. Proprietary schools are for-profit and the school's directors typically are not subject to ruling by a governing body or board. Finally, parochial schools are funded by a church or religious group and are often managed by an affiliate board or by the religious institution to which they belong. So there are 7 types of private school by Source Hussein classification: academically selective school, socially selective schools, schools of commitment, community schools, alternative schools, market school and charity schools. Academically selective schools for high achiever students may provide upward mobility to intelligent but low SES students. Socially selective schools, selection by location, fees or admission criteria, facilitate the reproduction of elite groups, and some public schools also have covert elite functions. The third private school, schools of commitment. School of commitment is a religious or ethnic schools aimed at the socialization of children according to the value and belief of the sponsoring community, and government tend to subsidize this type. Then, community schools. Community schools open to all children in a particular neighborhood. Equality, tolerance, social cohesion, deemed to be an agent of social reform and more prevalent in the public sector. Next, alternative schools. Alternative schools represent some educational or social philosophy, child-centered education. Next, market schools. Market schools for profit ventures, mostly specialist or vocational schools which train for some particular jobs. And the last one, charity school. Charity schools education for poor or handicapped children, and the state tends to take over these schools from their founder organization. There are 3 models of private education sourced by Giggle's model on private higher education. First one is mass private sector. The model is restrict size of public sector, selective admission in public school, mass provision of private instruction, relatively low standard of private institution, institutional hierarchy, example in Japan and Philippines, and this model for everybody has a chance but different in quality. Second one, parallel public and private sectors. Private schools are equal parts of the system. The quality of private education is in par with the public system. This model equal opportunity for all. This model a potential solution for multicultural, multi-ethnic or multi-religious societies, examples in Netherlands and Chile. The third one of models of private education, peripheral private sector. The public sector aims to provide the full range of education. Education is mostly a state monopoly. No recognition and financial support from the state. And for survival, private schools must find a special clientele so as to avoid competition with the public sector. Typical form of private education, example, conventional education, commerce trainings provided by private industry, schools for certain group of particular needs, singular high prestige institution with history of excellence, example in France and Turkey. This model is a smart move to privatize education. At the beginning, private education in Malaysia, in small tuition center, independent Chinese schools, and typewriting schools. In 1960s, after independence, a very selective public education system and high attention rates between primary and secondary level dropouts. In 1970s, nearly universal secondary education, the private sector shift towards the post-secondary, commercial and sub-professional courses. In 1980s, the rapid expansion of private education, especially of the post-secondary level, shift from elite to mass education, growing demand, use of English as a language of instruction, second chance for minority and weak students who were left of public universities, and innovative forms and solutions. And in 1990s, parallel growth of public and private higher education. By 2005, 30% of the respective cohort enrolled in higher education institutions. Education in Malaysia, private schools are required to abide by Malaysia's education law by following the Malaysian curriculum. Therefore, these private schools have to use the national preschool curriculum for preschool education and the national curriculum for primary and secondary education as required by the Education Act 1996. These do not include foreign system schools. Private schools are open to both local and international students. However, in order to enroll international students, the schools need to obtain a license from the Ministry of Home Affairs. Besides their school, some private schools also offer full residential facilities for students. All private schools need to obtain the approval of the Ministry of Education through its private education division before they are allowed to operate and recruit students. However, only schools that are licensed by the Ministry of Home Affairs are allowed to take in international students. There are 7 types of private institutions in Malaysia. Sources by Maran, Ranking Private School in Malaysia, Curriculum and their Values. First, preschool, primary school, secondary school, international school, expatriate school, special education, and private correspondence schools. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Pictures shown in this slide are the protests happened against privatization in education around the world, including countries such as US, Ghana, Chile, and South Africa. The protests happen because there are criticisms of privatization of education. I would like to discuss the 4 main criticisms here, including lack of public control and coordination, weaker national unity, the conversion of state revenue into private profit and social integration, lower pay and benefit for teachers. For lack of public control and coordination, One of the causes is the absence of the standardized national curriculum and tests. A standardized national curriculum and tests can promote a sense of structure for schools to maintain. Without them, there will be inconsistency among schools, especially on the level of students. If we decide to pursue privatization of education as a community, state or province, or country, then there must be additional efforts taken to ensure this information becomes available. This accountability comes at a higher cost, but it could be cheaper than a voucher program that lets parents transfer kids whenever they attend an underperforming schools. If this change does not take place, then tracking performance could be much more challenging. Besides, the school's resource like teachers will be not even among schools. For example, if a private school is located at rural area, it will be difficult to hire and get teachers to the school. If schools are under public control by government, the resource planning will be better and easier. For weakens national unity and social integration, one thing that will weaken the national unity and social integration is the language used in education. For example, in Malaysia, due to privatization of education, there are different types of schools. Government-supported national schools use Bahasa Malaysia, international school using English, and Chinese independent school using Mandarin. This different language will create the barrier of communication and weaken the national unity between students from different schools. Besides, with privatization, there will be more competitive among different schools. This may increase the unity within a school but weaken the overall national unity. The conversion of state revenue into private profit. The focus of private schools has shifted from providing education to earning money. This can be very well clarified from the higher donations demand for admission of even a bright child by such institutions apart from the pricey fee structure. Education has become a very profitable sector in the context of the voucher system in Sweden. In fact, in the first decade of the 2000s, free school companies have been more profitable than business in other sectors, and several of these companies have expanded abroad and have become attractive targets for equity companies, whose motivation is to generate profit for shareholders within a few years. The main point at this stage in the analysis is that focusing on the classical or business takeover of education distinction does not go to the heart of privatization in general or educational privatization in particular. This is that both of these forms rest on the conversion of state revenue into private profit via the magic of money. Money changes its form, its mode of existence in the privatization of education is transformed into profit, corporate interests, whereas investment funds and private individuals seek to skim off some of the 4.9 trillion of public funds for education and turn it into profit through running or buying educational institutes and services. Subman 2014 gets this point with confusing the issue by claiming that this is the redefinitions of public goods and services as private ones. That's the key point rather than a transformation in the social form of money. For-profit companies produce chains of charter schools that operate under a profit-driven model, which means hiring the least expensive teachers, not requiring teaching credentials, and making the bottom line, not students, their top priority. They are run mostly from outside the communities they serve, and their profit goes there too. For each child they teach, they receive public money, which effectively drains funds from the local public schools and makes them more likely to perform poorly, and yet with key law put into place, most charters are exempted from any public oversight, public money without any public rules. Who really benefit from privatization? People like private philanthropists, media, movie moguls, venture capitalists, publishing companies, software producers, online education providers, they all serve to benefit from their investment in the education system. For lower pay and benefit for teachers, due to the organization focus from quality diverted to quantity, more private schools are being built and opened. Even though the job opportunities has increased, but salary has decreased. Job security and satisfaction have lost. There seems no freedom for innovation in teaching as the private schools have their own set rules, methods which teachers has to follow. Very less chance for upwards mobility. Many times one has to obey the management where most of the members who are not qualified to fit into that position. The privatization bandwagon has been disastrous for teachers. It has contributed to the deprofessionalization, loss of status, and loss of hard-won influence and protection of teachers. Private schools teachers are generally not unionized, can be fired at will, and receive lower pay and benefits. One study of low-cost private school in India found that teachers' salaries were only 10% to 20% of public teachers' salaries. They also found poorly qualified and poorly paid teaching staff with high turnover. This is the exact opposite of the need to build a highly qualified, well-paid, and well-motivated professional teaching force. Two case studies happened in Ghana and also Hungary. Case study of low-cost schools in Ghana also found that the main source of cost and efficiency saving came from the super exploitation of teachers' labor by hiring non-unionized labor and paying them 15% to 20% of what Ghanaian teachers in the public sector take home. According to Daily News Hungary, salary for teachers in private institutions of higher learning does not match that of public institutions. This is mainly due to the heavy workload in the effort to outshine others in the same industry. Teachers end up doing a lot of work, which is not commensurate with the kind of compensation given to them.
Good day, everyone. I will continue to discuss about the other 5 criticisms of privatizations of education, namely impact trade union rights, quality assurance is not guaranteed, increase in educational inequality and equity, enhance socio-economic stratification, and gender inequality. Impact trade union rights. Forms of privatization in education has provoked a reworking of labor relations and conditions of employment. Due to privatization of education, there will be a mix of qualified and other teaching personnel inside education systems and even inside individual schools. Different teachers may have different individualized and flexible contracts and salary that are performance related. This brings with it concomitant constraints on the role of education unions and undermines collective bargaining and employment agreements. Moving from collective agreements to individualized temporary contracts makes it increasingly difficult to negotiate and bargain collectively, hence undermining fundamental democratic rights to organize and defend interests collectively. Next criticism of privatization of education will be quality assurance is not guaranteed. I will discuss about the quality of education in terms of the standards of teaching and learning in the context of institutions of higher learning. The concern with quality is easily noticeable in the ratio of full-time equivalent students to the number of academic staff, those who involved in teaching and research of public and private universities. This ratio gives an idea of each higher education institution's commitment to teaching and student support in lieu of any reliable method of assessing teaching quality. The universities with lower ratio of student to staff also have a good chance of creating an engaged and interactive teaching environment. This is the Times Higher Education World University Rankings in the year of 2020. We will compare between the private and public universities in Malaysia that are in the top 1,000 ranking. First of all, the University of Malaya, which is a public university, is ranked the top university in Malaysia. Next, the ratio of students per academic staff is one of the quality assurance indicators to compile the Times Higher Education World University Ranking. The ratio of students to academic staff in private institutions of higher education, for example, UTAR and UNITERN, which is 16.1, is higher than that in public institutions, such as University of Malaya, which is at 0.0, and University Science Malaysia, 10.7. Private institutions of higher learning are cost-conscious in relation to public universities in terms of the students to staff ratio, as they may increase the ratio to save costs. However, this would reflect itself in the quality of teaching and supervision and has obvious implications for the research output or industry collaborations of the academic staff in the private institutions. This table showed the number of academic staffs by level of studies in higher education institutions in Malaysia in the year of 2019. The qualifications of the academic staff in private institutions are also much lower on the average when compared to private institutions of higher education. In 2019, of the total number of PhDs in the higher education sector, only about 20% were working in the private institutions compared to about 75% of the academic staff with PhDs working in public universities in Malaysia. There are still about 25% of the academic staff in the private institutions of higher education that had only a first degree. In sharp contrast, more than half of the academic staff in public universities had a PhD and only about 5% had a first degree. The public universities have been able to upgrade the quality of their academic staff by providing generous scholarships and study leave schemes. For the vast number of private institutions who are working hard under sometimes onerous conditions, it may be a luxury to send academic staff on study leave to complete their higher degrees. Next, enhance socio-economic stratification. Privatization in education increases the gaps between the most advantaged socio-economic group and the least advantaged group. Private school students are far more likely to come from higher socio-economic backgrounds than students in public schools. Parents from higher socio-economic backgrounds are more likely to be able and willing to pay tuition fees at private schools, believing that these schools offer a better education, an environment more conducive to learning, additional resources, and advantaged parents are more informed or aware of the differences in quality across schools. Students who attend private schools that have access to more resources and offer a supportive learning environment are far more likely to perform better than students who attend schools with neither of these advantages. How students perform in school can have a great impact on their prospects in life later on. Although there is evidence of poor children attending private schools, there remain a small minority and often welfare sacrifices are made to face the costs. Privatization of education increases educational inequality and equity. According to the UNESCO 2015, the development of private provision of education seems unlikely to address the issue of poor children who cannot access schools and reinforce inequalities in education opportunities. Fees by their nature, regardless of how low, enact a barrier for some students. For example, some countries in Latin America have implemented privatization reforms through the education voucher system and made public investment in private education in the form of education vouchers. States offer school voucher programs as a way to give parents choices in what school their child attends. Parents receive funds to use towards the cost of private school. The typical dollar amount of a voucher varies, but it almost always falls short of the cost of a private school. Parents have to pay the difference between the voucher amount and the school's tuition. In the end, with the subsidy of education vouchers, the children of wealthy people have more conditions to enter private schools with first-class teaching quality and expensive tuition. Children from low-income families not only have no condition to enjoy good education, but also some students cannot afford various other educational expenses such as uniforms, books, development and examination fees, thus give up the use of education vouchers. Inequitable access is therefore inevitable. In the end, privatization causes upward mobility for some, but restricted mobility for others, especially the least advantaged socio-economic group. Lastly, privatization of education increases gender inequality. In the poor countries, the high cost of education in private schools has forced families with uncertain sources of income to choose which child they can send to school. In most cases, parents prioritize boys over girls. This is influenced by cultural beliefs in some rural and remote areas where girls are seen as a source of income once married off and boys as future breadwinners. Poor parents do not want to waste their meager resources on girls' education, so some drop up while others never enroll. So these are the criticisms of privatization of education. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullah and good day to all. I am Nodiana, will present about private higher education institutions in Malaysia. Background of private higher education in Malaysia. In the 1970s, higher education was monopolized by the public sector and there was public opposition to the establishment of private universities. The impetus for the privatization of higher education came after the 1985 to 1986 economic crisis, which placed limits on the expansion of the public provision of higher education. On 1990 onwards, there are parallel growth of public and private higher education. Private higher education institutions were officially recognized in Malaysia in 1996 with the enactment of Private Higher Education Institution Act 1996 and the amendments made to the Universities and University College Act 1971 and the Education Act 1961. Private higher educations are guided by Ministry of Higher Education policy guidelines and objectives. Private funded higher education institutions, which include private universities, private college and foreign university branch campuses. Next is the good side of private higher education institution in Malaysia. Private higher education institutions in Malaysia act as a complement to public higher education, and the formation of private higher education is to meet the huge demand for the higher education. And it also gives the second chance for the minority and students who drop out of public universities. Besides that, private higher education also provide greater opportunities to students to pursue higher education locally. Because of these opportunities provided by the private higher education, our students in the foreign country come back to Malaysia to further their studies in Malaysia because of lower tuition fees and lower living costs, and this help Malaysia to improve our economy and help Malaysia to stamp out the flow of education funds to other countries. Other than that, private higher education also help Malaysia to be recognized as highly reputable higher education international hub, and this contribute to the influx of foreign students, and it provides the result of large inflows of foreign investment in Malaysia. Private higher education institutions also play an important role as innovative solutions, as they do collaboration with foreign universities by offering twinning programs and preparatory courses. These institutions provide unavailable programs at public universities. Private higher education also as creation of integrated student career path by providing advanced standing program. Advanced standing program let the students to have a wide option of universities and courses, and students also will have advantage of experiencing learning in two countries. Besides that, private higher education also offer distance education, which is an advantage for the working students to further their studies, and it also help our country to increase the innovative capacity of economy by exploring new opportunities through research and development. Besides that, private higher educations, the majority of private higher educations use English as medium of instruction. So this is an advantage, especially for the foreign students to further their study in Malaysia, and it also dominance of foreign universities through linkage program. The programs is offered with lower tuition and living costs, and it also could be done locally through twinning or credit transfer with foreign universities. From this program, from this linkage program, the students can obtain foreign degree as an added value to the employability of the graduates. Besides that, private higher education also focus on quantity rather than quality, because the ratio of students per staff is higher than public universities. This situation encourages competition among private higher education institutions to give high commitment in providing the best infrastructures and services. The next point is all programs offered by the private higher education institutions in Malaysia are subjected to the accreditation requirement of MQA to ensure it is in line with the MQF. So the quality of the program offered by the private higher education is approved by the agencies, and that's why the number of students enrolled in the private higher education is increasing year by year from local and also from foreign countries. Although private higher education institution becoming the choice of many local and foreign students, but they still face with various challenges. This is some of the challenges that faced by the private institutions. One of the challenges is providing quality education. Accreditation as a challenge in delivering quality education. As we all know, accreditation is important to guarantee the students satisfy the minimum requirement before they enter the job market. We have to make sure, for example, medical or engineering students really achieve their minimum requirement before they start their job, because their job is involving life and safety matter. So we don't want to take risk to hire a worker which is not quality and not fulfill the minimum requirement to enter the job market. Okay, besides that, the facilities also is a challenge to the private higher education, because they need to spend in large amount of money to provide the physical and non-physical facilities, and also for their maintenance. Besides that, funding is also a challenge experienced by the private institutions intending to focus on research. We all know that research is important, because research will not only build the capabilities and reputations of the academics, but also serve as another marketing strategy to prove their institutions as a quality education provider. So the private institutions have problem with the funding, intending to conduct or focus more on research. And the next challenge is competition. Competition has created obstacles for Malaysian private higher education institutions in hiring and retaining quality academics, and as more attractive remuneration package in terms of salary and benefits are offered by the other private higher education institutions. This is statistic of number of private higher education institutions registered under Ministry of Higher Education in Malaysia until February 2020. Okay, the total number is 443, and this is the example of the private higher education in Malaysia, which is Sunway University, University Tun Abdul Razak, Multimedia University, Unicel, Unitar, University Teknologi Petronas, Lim Kok Wing University College, AIMS, University Tenaga Nasional, and more. Okay, next is the statistic of number of students in Malaysian higher education institution for public and private institutions by course in 2018. From the statistic, the highest enrollment in both public and private institutions is course of social science, business, and law. The students' enrollment for private institutions is more than 200,000, while the students' enrollment in the same course for public institutions is about 120,000 only, followed by course of engineering, manufacturing, and construction. The number of student enrollment in private institutions is about 100,000, while only about 80,000 in public institutions. This shows the important role of private higher education institutions as a complement to public higher education institutions to give more opportunities to many students that cannot further their study at public institutions. Okay, next is the comparison statistic of students' enrollment at higher education institutions in Malaysia from 2013 to 2017. Okay, from the table, we can see that the number of students enrolled in private higher education institutions increasing each year from year 2013 to year 2016. The number of students in private higher education institutions exceed the number of students in public higher institutions since 2015, and Malaysia expects to accept 200,000 international students in year 2020 and 250,000 in year 2025, according to Ministry of Higher Education at Going Global Conference 2018. Okay, for the conclusion, private educational institutions are to meet the needs of various, especially learning involving religion, culture, pedagogy, and others that can be considered as needs that cannot met by the public school system. Private educational institutions are able to reduce government spending, attract foreign students, and provide an alternative for students to choose to study abroad if private educational institutions are not offered. This helps to reduce the outflow of national currency. Next is, Malaysia's educational system has been reshaped in accord with the governmental socio-economic and development aspirations in transforming Malaysia from agrarian economy to industrialized and knowledge-based economy in purpose of enhancing the competitiveness of Malaysian economy. Private educational institutions need to adopt a learning organization culture to enhance organizational performance and promote organizational innovative for long-term success and long-term sustainability. Next is the programs offered and service provided by private higher educational institutions must be continuously relevant to the current needs and this dynamic and competitive higher education sector as well as demanding industrial requirement. And the last one is significant growth of both graduates and enrolled number of students. The role of education, especially private ones, can be considered a factor of social emancipation in aid construction of citizenship. The private education institutions, especially higher education, public entities in private nature should be seen not only as institutions that provide technical knowledge for labor market, but also especially as place of empowerment and building on an including society, contributing to the formation of citizens capable of making their own circumstance.